You watched me die. That was the first thing she said to me, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The music didn't stop. The chandelier above us still scattered light across a room full of people worth millions, but everything inside me went completely still as I turned toward the voice I shouldn't have recognized and saw her standing there like a memory that refused to stay buried. If you love emotional, cinematic stories of fate and power, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. I remember the exact way the air felt that night. Too cold for late September. The kind of cold that seeps through a tailored suit and settles somewhere under your ribs. And yet I felt nothing compared to the shock that locked my chest when my eyes found hers. 5 years. That's how long it had been since I last saw those eyes. 5 years since I stood 10 feet away and made the kind of decision a man can't undo no matter how powerful he becomes. And yet here she was breathing, alive, looking at me like she had been waiting for this exact moment. That's not possible, I said, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else, someone weaker, someone who didn't build an empire on control. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to, because the calm in her expression said more than any accusation ever could. I noticed the small details before anything else. The way her dark hair fell over one shoulder, the way her posture stayed steady, despite the crowd brushing past her, and then my gaze dropped, because I couldn't stop it, to the thin silver chain resting against her collarbone, and my stomach tightened as recognition hit me harder than anything I'd felt in years. I had seen that necklace before, not under warm lights and polished marble, but in the reflection of a night I had forced myself to forget, a night filled with rain and silence, and a choice I told myself was necessary. Where did you get that? I asked, stepping closer without realizing it, my voice low, controlled, but beneath it something cracked, something I didn't allow anyone to hear. She tilted her head slightly, studying me like I was the one who didn't belong here, like I was the stranger, and for the first time in years, I felt exposed under someone else's gaze. You don't remember? She said softly, and the words weren't loud, but they carried straight through me, unlocking something I had kept sealed shut. Images flickered in the back of my mind, quick, fragmented, incomplete, like pieces of a story I refused to finish. And I felt my jaw tighten as I forced myself to stay present, to stay in control, because that's what I do. That's who I am. People moved around us, servers passing with trays of champagne, conversations rising and falling, but none of it reached me anymore, because all I could see was her. All I could hear was that one sentence repeating in my head. You watched me die, she said again, quieter this time, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just a truth delivered with a kind of calm that felt far more dangerous than rage. I searched her face for something, anything that would prove this wasn't real, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became that the past I had buried wasn't gone at all. It had been waiting, breathing, standing right in front of me, and I realized then, with a clarity that settled deep in my chest, that whatever happened next, whatever truth she had come back to reveal, this night wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. She did not wait for my answer, and that was the first thing that unsettled me, because everyone waits for me. They always have, but she simply turned and walked away like I was just another man in the room, like I had never held power over anything that mattered. For half a second, I stood there, frozen in a way I had not been in years. Then instinct took over, and I followed, because there was no version of this night where I let her disappear again. The crowd shifted as I moved. People stepping aside without realizing why, their conversations lowering as if something in the air had changed. But my focus never left her, the steady rhythm of her steps, the way she did not look back, not once. Stop, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise, and this time she paused, just long enough to acknowledge that I was still there, before slowly turning to face me again. Up close, the details became impossible to ignore, the faint line near her wrist, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the quiet control in her breathing, all of it too real, too human to be anything but the truth I had been avoiding. You disappeared, I said, because it was the only version of the story I had allowed myself to believe, the only version that let me sleep at night. There was nothing left to find. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, something colder, sharper, like she had expected that answer and found it disappointing. "That is what you told yourself," she replied, and there was no anger in her tone, only certainty, which made it worse, because anger I could handle, anger I could fight, but certainty left no room for negotiation. I felt my jaw tighten as the room seemed to close in around us, the weight of 5 years pressing down in ways I had never allowed before, and for the first time in a long time, I did not have control of the narrative. "I searched," I said, the words coming out harder than I intended, because if there was one thing I needed her to understand, it was that I had not simply walked away, that I had done something, anything, even if it had not been enough. She took a small step closer, and the distance between us vanished, her presence sharper than any threat I had ever faced, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped just enough that only I could hear it. "You searched for a body," she said, "not for me." The words landed with a precision that made it impossible to deflect, impossible to reframe, and I felt something shift inside my chest, something I had kept buried under years of decisions and consequences. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to explain, but nothing came out, because there was no explanation that could rewrite what she was saying. Around us, the music continued, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, but it all felt distant now, like it belonged to a different world, one that no longer included me. She held my gaze for a moment longer, long enough for me to see it clearly, the truth I had refused to face. Then she stepped back, creating space again, not just physically, but in a way that felt final. "The difference matters," she said quietly, and then she turned once more, moving toward the far end of the ballroom where the shadows stretched longer, where the light did not quite reach, and this time, I did not hesitate, because I understood something now that I had not understood before, something that settled deep and heavy in my chest. She had not come back to be found, she had come back to be seen, and if I lost her again tonight, it would not be because she disappeared, it would be because I failed to follow. I followed her past the edge of the ballroom where the light softened and the music faded into something distant and hollow, the kind of place people passed through without noticing, but she stopped there like it was exactly where she intended to be, turning slowly as if she had known I would not let this end in a crowded room. "You always liked control," she said, her voice steady, almost thoughtful, and I felt the words settle under my skin because they were true, because control was the one thing I never allowed to slip, not in business, not in life, not even in memory. "And you always liked disappearing," I replied, sharper than I meant, because the alternative was admitting that I had lost her, that I had failed in a way I could not rewrite. Her lips curved slightly, not a smile, not quite, but something that suggested she understood more than she let on. "I did not disappear," she said. "I was left behind." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight, the kind that shifts something inside you whether you want it to or not, and I felt that shift now, slow and undeniable. I took a step closer, closing the distance she had created, because space felt dangerous, like something I could lose if I let it grow. "Then explain it to me," I said, my voice lower now, controlled but strained at the edges, because I remember that night, and I remember what was left, and none of it leads to this. Her gaze held mine, unwavering, and for a moment neither of us moved, the silence stretching between us, like a line neither one wanted to cross first. Then she reached up, fingers brushing lightly against the chain at her throat, drawing my attention again to the one detail I could not ignore. "You remember what you chose," she said, "not what actually happened." My chest tightened at that, because it implied something I had never considered, something I had not allowed myself to consider. And I felt the edges of that buried memory begin to shift, pieces loosening in ways that made it harder to keep them contained. "You are saying I was wrong," I said, but the certainty was gone now, replaced by something unfamiliar, something closer to doubt. She took another step forward, close enough now that the distance between us was measured in inches, close enough that I could see the faint rise and fall of her breath, the steadiness that never broke. "I am saying you stopped looking too soon," she replied, and there it was again. not anger, not accusation, just a truth delivered with precision, and somehow that made it worse. I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself in something solid, something I could control, but the ground beneath this conversation kept shifting, and for the first time in years, I was the one trying to catch up. 5 years, I said, more to myself than to her. The number heavy, real, impossible to ignore. You expect me to believe that you were just out there, alive, and no one knew? She did not answer immediately, and that pause said more than any explanation could, because it told me there was a story I had never heard, a truth I had never uncovered. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but no less certain. Not no one, she said, just not you. The words settled between us, final in a way that made it clear this was not just about the past, not just about that night, but about everything that followed, everything I had built on a version of events that might not have been true. I felt something tighten in my chest again. Sharper this time, because if she was right, if even a part of what she was saying was real, then the life I had constructed, the choices I had justified, all of it rested on something incomplete. I searched her face for anything that would give me certainty, but all I found was calm, controlled, unshaken, and it forced a realization I could not avoid. I had spent 5 years believing the story was over, but standing here now, watching her look at me like I was the one who did not understand, I knew with a clarity that settled deep in my bones that the story had not ended that night. It had only paused, and whatever truth she carried back with her was about to rewrite everything I thought I knew. The silence stretched longer this time, but it was not empty. It was heavy, filled with everything neither of us had said yet, and I realized that whatever answers I was expecting, she was not going to hand them to me easily. Then start talking, I said, quieter now, not a command, not quite, but something closer to a request than I had allowed myself to make in a long time. She studied me for a moment, her gaze steady, measuring, like she was deciding whether I deserved to hear the truth or if I had already lost that right years ago. You remember the rain, she said finally, her voice low, almost distant, and the moment she said it, I felt it again, not just the memory but the sensation, the cold air, the weight of the night pressing in, the way everything had felt final. Yes, I answered, because that part had never left me, no matter how much I tried to bury it. She nodded once, like she expected that, like she knew exactly which pieces of that night had stayed with me and which ones I had chosen to forget. And you remember leaving, she continued, and this time there was something different in her tone, not accusation, not anger, just a quiet emphasis that made the word feel heavier than it should have been. My jaw tightened slightly, because that part one remembered too. The decision, the moment I told myself there was nothing more to be done, the moment I turned away. I remember making a call, I said carefully, choosing my words the way I always did when something mattered. I remember making sure everything was handled. Her expression shifted, just slightly, but it was enough to tell me I had said the wrong thing. Handled, she repeated, and the way she said it stripped the word of its certainty, leaving something colder behind. She took a slow breath, like she was grounding herself, like she was deciding how much to give me. You made sure it was over, she said, but you never stayed long enough to see if it actually was. The words settled in, slow and deliberate, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, because that implication, that possibility, it did not fit into the version of events I had lived with for 5 years. There was nothing left to see, I insisted, but the confidence I usually carried was thinner now, less solid, like it was starting to crack under pressure. She shook her head once, not dismissive, just certain. There was, she said. You just chose not to look. I ran a hand slowly through my hair, the gesture automatic, a way to buy myself a second to think, to regain control, but control felt different now, less certain, like it did not belong entirely to me anymore. Then tell me what I missed, I said, because if there was a gap in the story, I needed to fill it. I needed to understand where things had gone wrong. She hesitated, and for the first time since she had walked into this room, I saw something flicker across her face. Not fear, Not hesitation exactly, but something more complicated, something that suggested this was not just a story for her. It was something she had carried alone for a long time. "You missed the part where I stood up," she said quietly, and the words hit harder than anything else she had said so far, because they were simple, almost understated, but they rewrote everything. I felt my breath catch, just slightly, because that image did not belong in the memory I had. It did not fit into the version of events I had accepted as truth. "That is not possible," I said again, but this time the words sounded different, less like a statement, more like a question I did not want answered. She held my gaze, unflinching, and whatever doubt I had was reflected back at me with absolute certainty. "It was," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no room for interpretation. The room around us felt distant now, the music, the voices, all of it fading into something irrelevant, because this moment, this conversation, was rewriting the past in real time. I swallowed slowly, trying to process it, trying to fit this new version into everything I thought I knew, but the pieces did not align, not yet. "If you stood up," I said, my voice lower now, more controlled but edged with something sharper, "then why did you not come back?" The question hung between us, heavy, unavoidable, and for the first time, she did not answer immediately. Her eyes held mine, and in that silence, I understood something before she even spoke, something that settled deep and cold in my chest. Whatever happened after that moment, whatever path she took, it was not a story I had been part of, and that, more than anything else, told me just how much I had lost without even realizing it. She did not look away when I asked, and that was what made the answer feel heavier before she even spoke, like the silence itself was preparing me for something I was not ready to hear. "Because there was nothing to come back to," she said finally, her voice steady, but there was something underneath it now, something quieter, something that felt older than 5 years. I frowned slightly, the words not landing the way I expected, because they did not fit into the logic I was trying to rebuild, the structure I relied on. "That does not make sense," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended, because confusion was not something I tolerated well, not in business, not in life, and definitely not in something this personal. She let out a slow breath, not frustrated, not impatient, just tired in a way that suggested she had already had this conversation in her head 100 times before tonight. "It does," she said, "just not from where you are standing." I felt my jaw tighten again, because I did not like that answer. I did not like being the one who did not understand, but before I could respond, she stepped slightly to the side, shifting the angle between us, and for a moment, the lights from the ballroom caught her differently, softer, almost distant, like I was seeing her through something instead of directly. "When you walked away," she continued, "you closed the story for yourself. You decided it was finished, and everything after that did not matter anymore because it did not affect you." The words were calm, but they landed with precision, cutting through the version of events I had held on to, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, sharper this time, because I recognized the truth in it even if I did not want to admit it. "That is not fair," I said, because it was the only defense I had left, the only way to push back against something that was starting to feel too real. She tilted her head slightly, studying me again, and there was no judgment in her expression, just a quiet understanding that made it harder to argue. "It is not about fair," she replied. "It is about what happened after you stopped looking." The phrasing caught me off guard. Not what happened that night, not what I remembered, but what came after, the part of the story I had never considered. "Then tell me," I said, and this time there was no sharpness in my voice, no edge, just a need to understand something that had slipped through my control. She hesitated again, but this time it was different, more deliberate, like she was deciding how much of herself to reveal, how much of the past she was willing to let me see. "I stood up," she repeated, softer now, like she was speaking more to the memory than to me, "and I waited." I felt my breath slow slightly, because that image, her standing there, waiting, it did not match anything I had allowed myself to imagine, and yet the way she said it made it impossible to dismiss. "For what?" I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it. Her eyes lifted back to mine, and for the first time since this conversation began, there was something there that had not been present before, something fragile, something that looked dangerously close to disappointment. "For you," she said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else, because it did not need explanation, it did not need context. It rewrote everything on its own. I felt something in my chest shift again. Deeper this time, because that meant she had expected me to come back. She had believed, even for a moment, that I would. Choose differently. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words did not come, because there was no response that could change what she had just said, no explanation that could undo the version of me she had been waiting for. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then shook her head slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, just in quiet acceptance of something that had already happened. "But you did not," she added, and the finality in those words settled between us, heavy and unmovable. Because in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity, something I had never allowed myself to see before. It was not just that I left, it was that she stayed long enough to realize I was not coming back. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, like something final that had already happened and could not be undone, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the memory I had lived with for 5 years. "You waited," I repeated, slower this time, because I needed to hear it again, needed to understand how that version of the night could exist without me ever knowing. She nodded once, a small movement, but it carried more weight than anything else she had done since walking into this room. "Long enough," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no anger, just a quiet truth that made it harder to ignore. I felt my chest tighten again, because that meant there had been a moment, a window of time where everything could have been different, where one decision, one step, could have changed the entire course of what came after. I stopped, the words catching before they could form, because what I thought did not matter anymore, not if it was wrong. She watched me, patient in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like she was giving me the space to catch up to something she had already accepted. "You thought it was over," she finished for me, and I exhaled slowly because that was exactly it. That was the version I had built everything on, the assumption that there was nothing left to return to, and when it was not. She continued, "I learned something you never had to." I frowned slightly because the statement felt incomplete, like there was more behind it, something I had not earned the right to understand yet. "What?" I asked, the question quieter now, stripped of the edge it once carried. She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze steady, but there was something else there now, something that had not been present before, something closer to distance than control. "How to walk away without expecting anyone to follow," she said, and the words landed in a way that felt deeper than anything else she had said, because they did not just describe what happened, they described who she had become after it. I felt something shift again, something uncomfortable, because that meant the person standing in front of me was not just someone who survived that night. She was someone who rebuilt herself without me, someone who learned not to rely on a choice I never made. I ran a hand slowly along the back of my neck, the gesture automatic, a way to ground myself, but it did not work the way it usually did, because there was no easy way to regain control of something like this. "You could have come back," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were weak, that they did not hold the weight they needed to, but they were the only thing I had left to push against what she was saying. She shook her head slightly, not dismissive, just certain, and that certainty was becoming harder to ignore with every second. "To what?" she asked, and the simplicity of the question cut through everything else, because it forced me to look at it from her side. Not mine, not the version I had constructed, but the reality she had lived. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came, because I did not have one, not a real one, not one that would justify coming back to someone who had already chosen to leave. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like tension and more like understanding settling into place, uncomfortable but unavoidable. She took a small step back, creating space between us again, and I felt it immediately, the distance not just physical, but something else, something that made it clear this was not a conversation she needed. It was one she had already finished long before tonight. "I am not here because I needed you to understand," she said quietly, and I felt the words land before I fully processed them, because they shifted the entire reason for this moment. I looked at her, searching for something, any indication of why she had come back at all, but all I found was that same calm, controlled presence that had unsettled me from the start. "Then why are you here?" I asked, and this time the question was real, not defensive, not controlled, just honest in a way I had not been in years. She held my gaze for a moment longer, and then something changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a decision being made. "Because you finally looked at me," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried something heavier beneath them, something that made it clear this was not just about the past. It was about what I had refused to see until now, and as I stood there, watching her, I realized that this night was not just about what I had lost, it was about what I had never allowed myself to recognize in the first place. Her words did not fade when she finished speaking, they stayed there, suspended between us, like something that refused to be ignored, and I realized that for the first time since she walked into this room, I did not have an immediate response, no control, no strategy, just the weight of what she had said pressing down in a way I could not deflect. "I always saw you," I said finally, the words coming slower now, less certain, because even as I said them, I knew they were incomplete, that seeing someone and truly recognizing them were not the same thing. She watched me carefully, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her gaze that told me she was listening, not for what I said, but for what I actually meant. "You saw what was in front of you," she replied, and there was no edge in her tone, no accusation, just a quiet correction that made the distinction feel sharper than anything else. I exhaled slowly, the sound barely noticeable under the music still drifting from the ballroom behind us, but inside me, everything felt louder, clearer, like pieces of something I had ignored were finally coming into focus. "Then help me understand it now," I said, and this time there was no command in my voice, no expectation, just something honest, something I had not allowed myself to use in a long time. She tilted her head slightly, considering me, and for a moment I thought she might refuse, that she might turn away again and leave me with nothing but fragments, but instead she stayed, her presence steady, grounded in a way that made it impossible to look anywhere else. "Understanding is not something I can give you," she said. "It is something you have to face." The words settled in slowly because they did not offer a solution, they did not give me a path forward, they simply placed the responsibility back where it belonged, on me, and I felt that shift more than anything else, the realization that this was not about her explaining the past, it was about me confronting it. I looked at her, really looked this time, not just at the details. I recognized, not just at the pieces that matched my memory, but at the parts that were different, the strength in her posture, the calm in her expression, the quiet certainty that had replaced whatever uncertainty she might have carried before. "You changed," I said, and it was not an accusation, not even a question, just an observation that felt overdue. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not need elaboration. "So did you," she replied, and something in her tone made me pause. Because it was not a compliment, not exactly, but it was not entirely critical either. It was something in between, something that suggested she saw more than I expected her to. I let that sit for a moment because it was true. I had changed, I had built something, become someone, but standing here now, none of that felt as solid as it usually did. None of it felt as certain. "Then why does it feel like I am the only one who is just now realizing it?" I asked, the question coming out before I could filter it, because it was the truth I could not ignore anymore. She stepped a little closer again, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make it clear she was still here, still part of this moment. "Because I already had to," she said softly, and there was something in those words that carried more than just time, more than just experience. It carried the weight of everything she had gone through without me. I felt my chest tighten again, but this time it was different, less sharp, more steady, like something settling into place rather than breaking apart. "And now?" I asked, because that was the part one did not understand, the reason she had come back, the reason she was standing here instead of somewhere else, living a life that no longer included me. She held my gaze, and for the first time, there was something there that felt almost open, not vulnerable, but not closed off either, like a door that had been locked for years was now slightly ajar. Now you get to decide what you do with it," she said, and the words did not feel like a challenge. They felt like a reality, something unavoidable, something that would not wait for me to catch up. I stood there, looking at her, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment, everything I had missed, everything I had chosen not to see, and for the first time in a long time, I understood something with complete clarity, something that cut through every layer of control I had built. This was not about the past anymore. It was about what I was willing to become now that I finally saw it. The weight of her words did not leave when she finished speaking. It stayed with me, settling deeper with every second that passed, and for the first time in years, I did not reach for control, I did not reach for certainty. I just stood there and let it exist. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly behind us, something slow and distant, but it felt disconnected now, like it belonged to a different version of the night, one that no longer included me. What if I choose wrong again? I asked, and the question came out quieter than anything I had said before, stripped of authority, stripped of certainty, because this time there was no room for either. She looked at me, really looked at me, and something in her expression shifted, not softer, not forgiving, but more open than it had been since she first spoke. "Then you live with it," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to soften the truth, just a simple answer that carried more weight than any reassurance ever could. I nodded slightly, because that was the part one understood, the consequence, the permanence of a decision once it was made. I had built my life on that principle, but this felt different, because this was not about power or strategy. This was about something I had once chosen not to see. I took a slow breath, the air cool against my lungs, grounding me in a way that felt unfamiliar, and I realized that for the first time, I was not thinking about outcomes, I was not calculating risk, I was simply present in the moment with her. "And if I choose to stay?" I asked, and the question lingered between us, heavier than I expected, because it was not just about tonight, it was about everything that could come after. She did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, like she was measuring the weight of the question before deciding whether it deserved an answer at all. "Staying is not the same as seeing," she said finally, and the distinction settled into place slowly, because it forced me to recognize that presence alone had never been enough. Not then, not now. I let that sit for a moment because it was true. I had been there that night, physically present, and it had not been enough. Not for her, not for what she needed, not for what I failed to give. "Then what does it look like?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no attempt to control the direction of the conversation, just a genuine need to understand something I had overlooked before. She took a small step closer, the distance between us narrowing again, and I felt it immediately, the shift in the air, the quiet intensity of her presence, not overwhelming, but undeniable. "It looks like you do not turn away," she said, and the simplicity of it made it hit harder, because it was not complicated, it was not something beyond reach. It was something I had chosen not to do. I felt something tighten in my chest again, but this time it was not confusion. It was recognition, because I knew exactly what she meant. I knew the moment she was talking about, the second where everything could have changed if I had just stayed. "And if I do not?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though it had been made clear long before tonight. She held my gaze, steady and unwavering, and there was no anger there. No resentment, just a quiet certainty that felt more final than anything else. "Then nothing changes," she said, and the words settled between us, calm and absolute, because they did not need to be louder. They did not need to be repeated. They were simply true. I exhaled slowly, letting that truth settle in, letting it take shape in a way I could not ignore, and for the first time, I understood that this was not about earning something back. It was not about fixing what had already happened. It was about what I chose to do now that I finally saw it clearly. She watched me for a moment longer, like she was waiting, not for an answer, but for a decision, and I realized then that this was the moment that mattered, not the past, not the years in between, but right here, right now. I met her gaze, steady for the first time since she walked into the room, and something inside me shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but in a way that felt permanent, like a line I could not cross back over once I stepped forward, because this time I understood what it meant to stay, and I understood what it would cost if I did not. I did not move right away, not because I did not know what to do, but because for the first time, the weight of the decision mattered more than the action itself, and I could feel it settling in my chest, steady and undeniable. The room behind us continued like nothing had changed. Laughter, music, the soft clink of glasses, but none of it reached me anymore, because this moment had separated itself from everything else, like the world had narrowed down to just the space between her and me. She did not speak, did not rush me, and that silence felt intentional, like she had already done her part, like whatever came next belonged entirely to me. I looked at her, not the way I had before, not searching for proof or contradiction, but seeing her, really seeing her, the calm in her expression, the strength in the way she stood, the distance she no longer tried to hide, and I realized that she was not waiting for me the way she once had. She was simply here, present, offering nothing more than the truth of who she had become. I stayed once, I said slowly, the words forming with a clarity that surprised even me. But not long enough. She held my gaze, and there was no reaction, no interruption, just that same quiet attention that made it impossible to lie, even to myself. I took a step forward, closing the distance fully this time, not out of urgency, not out of fear, but because it felt like the only honest choice left. I am not asking you to trust me. I continued, my voice steady, grounded in something that felt different from anything I had relied on before. I am choosing not to turn away again. The words settled between us, not as a promise, not as something that demanded belief, but as something simple and real, something that did not need to be dressed up to matter. She studied me for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of that gaze, not judging, not searching for weakness, just observing, as if she was measuring whether this version of me was something she recognized or something entirely new. That is your choice, she said finally, and there was no approval in it, no reassurance, just acknowledgement, and somehow that made it feel more real, more solid than anything else she could have said. I nodded once, because that was enough. It had to be. This was not about convincing her, not about rewriting the past. It was about standing in the present and not stepping back when it mattered. She took a small step away then, not retreating, just shifting the space between us again, and I felt it, the subtle change, like a line had been drawn, not as a barrier, but as something that would need to be crossed with more than words. Then, "Stay," she said, and this time there was something different in her voice, not softness, not quite, but something that felt open, like a door that had not been fully closed after all. I held her gaze, steady, and for the first time since she walked into this room, I did not feel the need to chase, to prove, to control. I just stayed exactly where I was. The moment stretched, quiet and grounded, and I realized that nothing about this felt dramatic. Nothing about it felt like a grand resolution. It felt simple, almost understated, and that was what made it real. She turned slightly, her attention shifting toward the edge of the ballroom, the world waiting just beyond this moment, and I followed her movement without stepping away, without breaking the space we had created. For a second, I thought she might leave again, that she might walk back into the crowd and disappear the way she had before, but she did not. She paused, just enough to make it clear that this time was different. I exhaled slowly, the air steady in my lungs, and understood something with a clarity I could not ignore. This was not the end of anything, not a resolution, not a return. It was the beginning of something I had never allowed before, a choice that would have to be made again and again, not in words, not in moments like this, but in everything that came after. And as I stood there beside her, not ahead, not behind, just present, I realized that for the first time, I was not trying to rewrite the past. I was learning how to live with it without turning away. This is only the beginning. Subscribe if you dare to see what happens next.